Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As people are walking in here, we'll get going. We're delighted to have you to join us today here at the University of Minnesota China Center's Considering China webinar series. My name is Joan Brzezinski, and I serve as the director of the China Center. Thank you for being with us for today's program, Make China Great Again, online alt history fiction, national revival, and popular authoritarianism, featuring Professor Rong Bin Han. Professor Han is a professor of international affairs at the University of Georgia and earned his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. His research focuses on social activism, media politics, digital politics, and political participation in authoritarian contexts, particularly in China. He's an author and co-author of several influential works, including Contesting Cyberspace in China, Online Expression and Authoritarian Resilience, Directed Digital Dissidence and Autocracies, How China Wins Online, and his forthcoming book, Make China Great Again, Online Alt History Fiction and Popular Authoritarianism. He also co-edited the Xi Jinping Effect. Today's discussion explores the fascinating, rapidly growing phenomena in Chinese digital culture, online alternative history fiction. Across Chinese internet platforms, millions of readers and writers imagine revisiting pivotal moments in history to reshape China's destiny. These stories range from reimagining dynastic survival to reinventing revolutionary movements, all centered around themes of national revival, political identity, and China's future. This promises to be a thought-provoking conversation about politics, culture, media, and the power of storytelling in a digital age. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rongbin Han. Thank you.
Thank you, John, very much for the very warm introduction. You've summarized everything so nicely. I think I can just kind of stop and, call it a day. But it's such a pleasure and honor to have the opportunity to speak at the China Center, University of Minnesota. And thank you, Haiyan, for coordinating everything. So my talk today is based on my book that has recently come out with Columbia University Press. So if you're interested, you can get a copy from Amazon or from the press's public website. So I'm not sure if you've been wondering what would you do if you could travel back in time. But apparently many people have thought about it. In a 2022 Foreign Affairs article, political scientist Andrew Nathan discusses the alternate history of China in the context of the late 1980s, leading to the Tiananmen Square movement, asking, could Beijing have taken a different path? As a keen reader of Chinese web novels, I find the question immediately relevant, but not quite new, as millions of Chinese have explored similar questions through the popular genre of internet literature, the alternate history fiction, which typically involves traveling back time and changing the course of historical development of China. And by producing and consuming such works, writers and readers alike task themselves with questions like whether China could have taken different paths of development and how they would change the nation's history were they ever offered the opportunity. While such writings are inherently consumerist in nature, I have long believed that they're political. But in what ways? And what are the political implications? In my book and this talk, I attempt to address the above questions by examining internet literature, especially the alt history fiction, to understand the ideational world of contemporary Chinese. I argue that these novels embody how contemporary Chinese imagine an ideal China and how to achieve such an ideal China. Their imagination results in a variety of Chinese dreams, which resonate with official state ideology on the one hand, and contest and negotiate state ideological governance on the other hand. Overall, the process contributes to authoritarian legitimation. In short, The main theoretical argument or contribution of the book is that it goes beyond explaining how strong authoritarian regimes like China may survive digital challenges and shows how digital experiences may enable popular participation in legitimizing and justifying authoritarian rule. I'm not going to go into the tons of literature or studies to situate my research in for the sake of time, but I'm happy to talk more about it. In a nutshell, at the very beginning of the kind of the spread of internet in China, people expected the technology to be liberalizing and democratizing. It turned out not to be the case. And then we're rushing to explain why. And some people say it's because the authoritarian state is too strong. They're able to censor and control population information and everything. And there are people not satisfied with that explanation, including me, and saying maybe it's because the internet is not as subversive as a lot of people imagine. People go online not talking about politics. The majority of them are indeed like that. Or when they talk about politics, as my first book argues, there are actually very different voices, and the pluralization of those voices help cancel each other off. So the regime isn't challenged that much, right? And now in this particular talk and book, I'm trying to explain it's more than that. Okay, popular experiences online can help legitimize the regime. So there is the change from authoritarian resilience to authoritarian legitimation. Okay. See, change. So, what is internet literature? According to some previous scholars, they define internet literature in different ways. Guobin Yang says all web-based writings that are viewed as literature by their authors or readers can be defined as internet literature. Michelle Hawkes, who has a book on internet literature in China, defines internet literature as something written especially for publication in an interactive online context and meant to be read on screen. And you can see both definitions are not really emphasizing the innovation in writing styles and tactics, but more the methods in which literary works are distributed and consumed. Okay. So internet literature emerged as early as the Chinese internet in the 1990s and has grown from an online hobby, from literary enthusiasts to a hyper-commercialized industry. And as of June 2023, when I actually kind of finished the last draft of the book, there are over 500 million users, roughly 50% of Chinese internet population. And the graph here shows the user base of internet literature kind of over time. And when we talk about internet literature, it's also worth highlighting that while they have many forms, in the Chinese context, internet literature primarily refers to genre fiction that are published in installments regularly, typically daily, for readers to consume. Okay. So this is a screenshot of the most successful internet literature portal on the left, Qidian.com, or starting point. Qidian introduced a VIP system in August 2003, under which readers can access non-VIP content for free, but must pay for the VIP content. This pay-for-read or pay-to-read model contribute to the commercialization of internet literature, because now platforms and writers can benefit from writing, making the whole industry more sustainable. Before that, there were other efforts trying to commercialize online writing, but not quite successful. In addition, this model also lead to the dominance of genre fiction because those long novels can glue readers for longer and maximize revenue for platforms and writers. okay? And on the right side, that's a screenshot of like a reading app, okay, called developed by Tencent, which is also the owner of WeChat and also owns Xidian. Okay, they have a very ambitious like internet literature kind of industry there. They had demonstrated huge um, ambition there because they wanted to control the upper stream of China's pan-entertainment industry. So indeed, actually, internet literature has been viewed as the upper stream of China's pan-entertainment industries. Okay, as I said, today internet literature is dominated by genre fictions. What are those genres? I'm just using Qidian as an example there. Different platforms have slightly different categorizations. Okay, on Qidian, the works are categorized in terms of whether they're male-oriented or female-oriented. So there's a gendered aspect, which is very interesting, but it's not the focus of the talk on my book. I'm more than happy to discuss that. Okay. And this table only includes works that are completed and are over 2 million Chinese characters, so very long ones. To give you a reference point, the entire Harry Potter series in Chinese is about 3 million characters. The entire Harry Potter series, okay? And I highlighted two genres, which is history and military affairs, which overlap significantly with the type of fiction that I'm most interested in, which I call Make China Great Again, alt history fiction. And I will return to this point later. And this is a kind of genres targeting female readers. It's worth highlighting that, as I already mentioned, internet literature, especially genre fiction, has become the upper stream of China's pan-entertainment industry. They've been adapted to TV series, TV dramas, movies, games, comics, and all sorts of things like that. Reportedly, between 2018 and 19, among the top 100 hottest movies and TV dramas in China, 42 were adapted from internet literature works, fiction, okay, the fiction web novels. And this is a screenshot of the popular TV drama, My Heroic Husband, which is adapted from online fiction. So on the left side, that's the cover of the online book of fiction. On the right side, that's the drama. So evidently, internet literature has become an important online cultural consumerist experience in China. And how to study it to better appreciate its richness, dynamics, and complexity, I conceptualize internet literature as a commodified political field, as illustrated here for purpose. In short, I see it both as a cultural consumerist realm that subjects platforms, writers, and readers to the rules of attention economy, and a political realm of expression and ideational contestation where the state sets the bottom line, but various sources of voices would flourish with the market and digital platforms mediating the process. As I said, my research focuses on a particular web novel genre, alt history fiction, which often involves time traveling back to a certain historical time to change history, to save or revive China from internal or external crisis. This is why I call them Make China Great Again fiction. To have a sense of what Make China Great Again novels look like, let's look at a few examples, including some of my personal favorites. So the first one is Ursa Ping Ming. It's a story of a contemporary Chinese traveling back to late Ming time and defeated the Manchu forces, preventing them from taking over and establishing the Qing dynasty. This fiction is ostensibly anti-Manchu and Han chauvinistic. It reportedly promoted a reader, a fan, to slap the Manchu historian expert Yan Chonglian 2 times at a book signing event in 2008. This fiction also single-handedly almost changed popular perception towards late main intellectual group from more positive to more negative. And the next one is industrial tycoon, which is contemporary Chinese going back to 1979. That's the time of China starting economic reform in this universe, right? And the main character used his expertise and foresight to create an industrial empire from scratch, helping China win the economic and geopolitical competition with the US. The concluding chapter of that fiction was was a scene of a nuclear-powered Chinese aircraft carrier visiting New York, symbolizing Chinese naval force being on par with the old hegemon, the United States. And you can see all those kind of works are pretty popular with a lot of recommendations. Those are done quite a few years ago. Ursupamine was done in 2008, and then Industrial Tycoon was done before COVID. Here are a few more of those works. For time's sake, I'm not going to be able to go into the details, but there are a few of my favorites, so I'm going to mention them very briefly. The Morning Star of Lingao is a very fascinating fiction because it is a story of 500 contemporary Chinese traveling back to late Ming Dynasty together, bringing literally a full ship of industrial equipment and modern knowledge base with the aim to reform and industrialize China then. And the novel features a networked production model with many netizens contributing to it. That's something worth noting. And also, a lot of people in China see that novel as symbolizing a particular kind of online school of thought, calling themselves the industrial party. It's a group of people who believe that industrialization is going to help China ultimately, and that's the only mission of China. They should keep industrializing and improve their industrial capacities, which echoes China's kind of industrial policy if you think about it. And the other one I wanted to highlight is the last one called Red Dawn. It's about traveling back to late Qing Dynasty to 1905 more specifically, launching a communist revolution before the Chinese Communist Party was ever founded. And the main character is depicted as Mao loyalist who copies his revolutionary tactics and strategies. And another interesting point is that this fiction is censored by the party. The party doesn't like people to advocate communism, especially when it is used to launch a revolution. Now, you may wonder whether I simply cherry-picked those titles, right? So let me briefly explain my methods. In addition to digital ethnographic work, I personally read over 70 titles and following discussions on them. That was fun, okay. But I also collected all titles listed on a popular novel recommending platform. Out of the 260,000 plus titles, I coded the most popular 2,100, identifying 238 that fall into the category of Make China Great Again fiction. And then a student assistant and I coded the top 200 Make China Great Again fiction in terms of what historical time they focus on and what reforms they propose. And this graph illustrates the historical periods of those 200 fiction. You can see the Ming Dynasty really stand out. You may wonder why. I guess that's because Ming Dynasty is the last Han Dynasty. After that, it's it's the Manchu Dynasty Qing. And given the nationalistic nature of those fiction, this is not quite surprising. Okay. Sorry, my cat is here. I need to actually release her. Anyways, overall, those works attempt to transform China in almost all aspects. So I'm going to show you the coding results. They tried mandatory reforms. Actually, out of the 200, 123 tried mandatory reforms, reforming military organization, training, and kind of bringing modern technologies such as firearms and everything. They did like scientific and technological reforms. Most of those works touched upon economic reforms. They introduced commercial economy, even capitalism, quite a bunch of them, kind of combined with the scientific and technological reform, started industrial revolution, and then kind of, turned China into a full capitalist society in kind of many senses. And there are social cultural reforms and everything. And there are a few things I wanted to highlight. Other than that, you can see political reforms is the least tried reforms, less frequently proposed. Not quite surprising, because due to political constraints, right? That said, quite some titles introduce political reforms, including competitive elections, parliamentary politics, and all sorts of things like that. I'll talk a little bit more about that later when I discuss everything. And also, 142 of those fictions touch upon Han minority issues, which is something I noted very interesting. Though almost all of those works assume a Han-centric perspective, they have different approaches to deal with the minorities. Some are suppressive, where others attempt to build more equal and harmonious Han minority relations. Okay? What is particularly interesting that there are two ethnic minority groups that are hated most. One is the Manchu, the other is Mongol. So it's like two recent minority dynasties, and you can see why actually Ming Dynasty really stands out. And finally, you can see Make China Great Again titles overall also have a expansionist tendency. So by extension, we mean going beyond historical territorial boundaries and annex or colonize other parts of the world. Okay, those works can go crazy in terms of how they're trying to kind of, expand. Some of them, discover North America before the Western European kind of, colonists arrived here. So all those kind of stories there. Some of them are a lot more like expanding China's boundaries in the periphery, like to Vietnam, to Korea, Japan. Those are kind of very much pretty frequent there. So 129 of those 200 titles kind of, show some different degrees of expansionist tendency. Now, evidently, Make China Great Again novels are outright political. Their shared emphasis on China revival echoes the official ideology, right? Chinese Dream, coined by President Xi Jinping. In fact, many of those works emerged before the Chinese Dream proposition. So I think that's something worth noting, suggesting that it's not necessarily that the Chinese state trying to brainwash Chinese people, indoctrinating them with this nationalist sentiment. It might be the state riding with the collective ethos of contemporary Chinese society rather than leading it. Of course, each of those works can also be considered as doing a thought experiment. They reflect a variety of dreams which echo the Chinese dream at the core, but also represent popular participation and contestation of the state ideology. For instance, the fiction Red Dawn I mentioned earlier preached communism, which affirms the regime's historical legitimacy, yet is considered as a threat by the party today, because the party already kind of, in the reform era deviated from its communist route. So that's why it's actually censored. So what are the implications? Especially for regime legitimacy, I argue that they overall contribute to authoritarian legitimation. How? First, as I mentioned, those works demonstrate an explicit nationalist appeal, which echoes the official discourse of national revival or Chinese dream. And in fact, existing studies suggest that in China, contemporary China, nationalism tends to go hand in hand with regime support. And this is kind of animated fiction about traveling to Qing dynasty, which was about 2,000 years ago, to help unify China and expand. And the main character discusses Japan, Korea, saying that about Japan, of course, we have deep-seated hatred that cannot be erased. Korea won't bite you, but will disgust you a lot in the future. That reflects popular sentiment today, right, towards Japan and Korea quite well. Many other Make China Great Again titles display an communism nostalgia, which affirms the regime's historical and ideological legitimacy to some extent. This works, I argue, pass on the red genes in different ways. Some, like the Red Dawn I discussed earlier, are ostensibly preaching communism, okay, to the extent that even the party can't stand with it. The party even thinks it's too much. Some are recognized by readers as this kind of aid communist fiction. It's a sub-genre. In this works, the main characters, often time travelers, go back into history and try to assist the party and the regime in various ways. One example is shown here. It's titled Never Declassify. It's a young man going back to 1980s as the reform starts and helps the party to predict the major domestic and international trends, such as, the collapse of Soviet Union, so that China can take advantage of everything. And also, communist ideology and practices can be found in many of the titles as cultural memes. For instance, land reform is widely used as a tactic, kind of to develop the economy or to kind of, buy off the peasants and everything. And many other works also embrace implicitly the communist worldview and outlook. They generally sympathize with the have-nots and advocate the idea of economic and infrastructure determining political superstructure. Now, admittedly, those novels may challenge the state as I highlighted. Quite some of them have discussed alternative political systems and ideas like parliamentary politics and popular elections. Even those embracing communism bear ambivalent implications, as the state in the reform era has arguably betrayed its communist root. And the expansionist and Han chauvinistic tendencies found in many works are not quite compatible with China's official foreign and ethnic policies, at least on surface, right? And the state also worries that those works would promote what they call historical nihilism, as hypothesizing changes in history ultimately deviates from official narratives about history. Moreover, as consumerist experience, these works often reflect personal desires that are not always in line with the socialist core values the state advocates. For instance, we did this coding, finding that out of the 200 fiction titles we coded, 126 included stories of the main characters, men, okay, marrying or having affairs with more than one woman. That's not permitted under the current system. And that's why a lot of people call those titles or those stories YY or pop dreams. Okay. Now, despite such deviations, those works overall are not threatening towards the regime, not just because such deviations are typically minor, non-systematic, and guided, but because they justify authoritarian rule in several ways, as I argue here. So first, they help popularize official narratives about history and the regime by echoing the state's nationalist narratives, such as century-long humiliation, and by allowing ordinary citizens to make China great again, right? Even in ways different from the official ideology, make a fiction, make national revival more relevant to everybody, and official ideology of Chinese construct more embracive. Also, as mentioned above, many have directly drawn inspirations from the party's revolutionary history, ideology, and strategy, thus directly affirming the regime's legitimacy. Where those advocating communism are diligently censored by the state, suggesting they're a little bit threatening, they may not be that threatening because they inherently affirms the regime's historical and ideological legitimacy. What they demand is not overthrowing the regime, but instead the regime go back to its communist root. Okay. Second, they have a pro-status, like status quo function. Since they all typically center on historical crisis, merely describing the bloodshed, violence, sufferings in troubled times can help readers recall the bitterness of the past and remind them of the happy life today, right? And third, this is indirect. Okay, these works are super popular and they function to marginalize traditional intellectual and cultural elites in China, who, despite state control and co-optation since 1989 in particular, they're still very critical. Okay, but their works are not read anymore. Okay, their influence has significantly diminished as less people read their works and more people are reading those fiction. And as I mentioned earlier, some people learn history from those works, and they actually even face slapped a Manchu expert, right? In some, through actively engaging with state ideology in a non-threatening fashion, those works embody what Althusser describes as ideological interpellation, which is a process through which the ruling ideology recruits and transforms the individuals into subjects. Yeah, this is the only quote I have, so don't worry about it. Of course, here I argue that the ruling ideology is subject to negotiation. That said, since those novels, like other forms of online expression, are subject to state control, the state can effectively set the bottom line. So it's not that threatening. Okay, quickly, how readers receive Make China Great Again fictions before we conclude the talk. Readers are very important in internet literature. By actively engaging in sharing, commenting, and discussing those novels, they co-produce the cultural consumerist experiences and participate in ideological contestation with the state platforms and writers, just like the writers, okay? Therefore, it's important to analyze how they receive those titles. For this purpose, I conducted topic analysis of top reader comments on the Megaga, or Make China Great Again fiction, as well as non-Make China Great Again fiction. And I identify four salient discursive themes. First is primarily about the literary and aesthetic quality of the works. The second reflect more readers' comments and criticism of the storylines. The third reflects more personal desires to pursue power. And the fourth is political and reflects the mega nature. Now, that's boring. Closer reading of the comments are more interesting. You can see from here. Oops. So basically, readers also participate, as I said, in ideological interpellations through commenting. So instead of just kind of analyzing those kind of topics and show you the keywords, let's read a few of those and go deeper into this. So they can be the kind of their participation in the ideological interpellation can be best illustrated by an interesting finding of the frequent word analysis, which I read closer. Okay, so comparing comments on the Make China Great Again fictions versus those non-Make China Great Again fiction titles, the number one unique keyword stands out is actually but. Okay, it appeared 159 times. It's very funny why people talk about but. And I looked closer. It happened so that the but issue refers to one's political stance, i.e., which side you should side with. So therefore, it plays a similar function to political correctness in the West. And closer examination shows that they have two dimensions. One is nationalism, the other is communism. You can see that echoes the Make China Great Again fiction titles in themselves. The nationalism dimension is straightforward, requiring one to stand with China and Han Chinese, right? So if you go back to Qing Dynasty, the only but correct option is to rebel against the Manchu. But if you are going to Ming Dynasty, you can either overthrow the empire or save it because it's a dynasty of the Han Chinese. By the kind of the nationalism standard, either option is okay. Okay. The other dimension is like pro-people and pro-communism. While not without contestation, this tendency is something very salient. This is partially reflected in the popularity of the 8 communist titles. I mentioned the title Never Declassified, for instance. It's the third most bookmarked among all the 238 Make China Great Again titles I quoted. Okay, so of course, it's worth noting that reader comments do show a high level of diversity. There's a quote here, and I'm not going to read it because it's not political, but kind of sexist. Okay, so overall, through commenting, readers also co-produce the digital experiences and the discourses here, where both nationalism and class dimension of but correctness bear ambivalent implications for the party's rule. They overall do not pose a severe threat, okay, but instead contribute to authoritarian legitimation. Now, before concluding, let's put Make China Great Again fiction into the historical context. Those works emerge in the age of China rise. In a sense, they're like MAGA in the United States. To some extent, they're the two sides of the same coin, and at least partially the result of globalization that we've experienced in the past few decades. The differences are, however, China benefited from globalization, while the US and some European countries view themselves as losing out in the process, right? And also, these novels are comparable to the late Qing and Republic era sci-fi fiction when the Chinese were experiencing the national humiliation and seeking how to save China. At that time, with no hope in the past or present, Chinese had to look for national salvation in the future through sci-fi works. An example here is Liang Qicao, reformer and activist of late Qing and the early Republic era. It's like he is the author of The Future of New China, which is a sci-fi looking into the future. Mega fiction, in contrast, have emerged in the age of China rise. Contemporary Chinese are overall happy with the present and are confident in the future. So through writing, they attempt to remedy sorrows in history. In doing so, they connect China's past, present, and future. And indeed, this collective ethos, sentiment, goes beyond the Make China Great Again fiction I observe. Take a look at this viral song, the lyrics, As You Wish, which is the promotional song for the Doorbuster Man Melody movie, celebrating the party's 100 years anniversary. My Country, My Parents, that's the title. You can see clearly that the song is a confession that the Chinese today, right? So make to their forefathers, which is basically you, who have sacrificed for national revival. There's also the promise about the future. You can see the terms like tomorrow, children, the world you were never able to see indicate, right? This sense of inheritance and connection among past, present, and future generations echo what is found in mega fictions. So, last slide, conclusion. The book and the talk examines the everyday digital experiences of internet literature that are co-produced by the state, society, and the market. Such experiences, I argue, serve a critical and yet understudied function of socializing citizens in authoritarian politics and in the negotiation of authoritarian ideological governance. This process may lead to what I call pop hegemony, which because it is popularly negotiated, citizens may willingly embrace. So in a way, it's not 1984 that's something we worry about. It's actually the brave new world of 1984. Of course, that's a little bit too pessimistic. So while I argue that such digital experiences contribute to authoritarian legitimation, there are two important caveats. So first, the platforms, writers, and readers are not completely in line with the state in terms of both interests and ideational orientations, as you can see. Second, I think, which is more important, the consent negotiation is an ongoing process, and pop hegemony is still in the making, and the state does not really have full control over the process. In fact, the process is as much about the state adapting to the challenges and justifying it through as citizens making sense of and reconciling with the system they live in. Thus far, the party has actually demonstrated an overly suppressive and controlling tendency, which, given the reasoning of pop hegemony, I think it's self-defeating. Thank you. I look forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Thank you. Really,
Oops.
thanks so much about this presentation. It is really fascinating. We did have a slight question early asking if any of the fiction that you've been discussing has been translated into English.
That's a great question. So internet literature, Chinese internet literature is huge in China. They are less so in overseas in general. But there are some of those works being translated. But most of those works are mystical or martial arts genre, not this kind of old China history fiction. Why? It's pretty easy to understand. I guess foreigners probably don't echo with those works, right? It's like if I'm American, why would I read a fiction that makes China great again?
I have a question. I'm wondering what demographics do these novels actually appeal to most? I mean, I feel like you have to have some sense of history
Right.
to enjoy perhaps the alternate path, but I'm wondering if, young readers or old readers, or if you're seeing a demographic alignment.
Unfortunately, sorry about this. Unfortunately, I changed my research plan. Originally, I tried to go back to China, do some field work, and do a survey to have a better sense about the readership and everything. Unfortunately, because of COVID, I have to change my plan, moving entirely online, and I give up that. So we don't know. But
Okay.
based on the circumstantial evidence I have, there are two things I'm certain. So the readers are predominantly male and predominantly Han Chinese. The readers as well. We were able to kind of code some of those writers or authors. Not all of them, because not all of them have like full information online. They are overwhelmingly like male and Han Chinese writers. I also presume that they're young.
Thank you. Other questions? Anybody have a question? You want to put it in the Q&A box?
There's a question from Jim asking novels being translated into English are heavily dependent on the quality of the translator. Which publishers have the best translations of books such as uh, Usurping Ming or Industrial Tycoon?
Okay. Honestly speaking, I don't think there are translations of those. I read them, I translate the titles. I didn't translate the whole web novels. But if it's a kind of profitable industry, maybe somebody is going to do it. But as I said, there are actually some of those platforms dedicated to translate Chinese internet literature works, genre fiction in particular, into English. But as I said, most of those websites focus on like mythical fairy tale kind of, or martial arts fiction, not the alt history fiction. It's like there is a pretty decent size of readers on Chinese martial arts even Chinese sci-fi to a certain extent. I think the Three Body Problem by Liu Cixin has been translated and it's available on Amazon. And President Obama even recommended it. It's also adapted to kind of TV drama series. It's fascinating. I would recommend you read it, but it's kind of contemporary Chinese like sci-fi, which is not the type of old history fiction that I study.
Yeah, thank you. You actually asked, I think, answered his follow-up question, so thank you so much. He wanted to understand about the transactions due to the three-body problem being converted to English and horribly Anglified in the process. So I think we've addressed that. To what extent are the Make China Great Again internet fiction patriarchal and heteronormative? Have you encountered any works that are feminist or queer friendly, and what are they like?
Okay, now let me look at this genre of fiction. So, categories, right? It's not a coincidence that those literature portals would kind of, try to direct male and female readers to different categories or different platforms even. Indeed, there are some of those platforms catering to female readers. And it's like one of them is called Jingjiang Wenxuezhen, which is interesting. It's primarily female romance type of stories. But on that platform, it's like it's also nationalistic, which is something I didn't make very explicitly. But it's like a bunch of those writers and readers on that platform like are called later the Little Pink. If you ever heard about that idea, it's like people defending the Chinese regime. Some of them are called Little Pink, and you derive that term from that platform. But anyways, on Jidian alone, you can see these are the different genres, and males and females are very different. There are a few female writers, as far as I know, have written a alt history fiction. And because the writers are primarily male, you don't really see too much actually traits of a female writer there. Okay. Online literature or internet literature in general nowadays is a consumerist industry. You have to bear writers or consumers or audience in mind when you write. So that's the point. And there are a lot of, I quoted the 2,100 popular titles from the book recommending like platform. 400 or so of them involve time traveling, but only 238 are alt history, make China great again fiction. What about the remaining ones? Many of them are actually by female writers, and they time travel back to develop romantic relationships with people. They're essentially romances. So if you look at the genre here, ancient romance, okay, is the largest category here. It's the largest category here, 40% for female writers. And then contemporary romance, the second largest, almost 80%, right? So internet literature is very gendered.
Thank you. What percentage of Make China Great Again literature would hail to a time where filial piety or spiritual direction was a more primary versus material advancement, more primary focus?
Very few of them, I would say. Virtually all of them try to modernize China. They focus on, I mean, as I said, this is kind of a genre that needs to be understood in kind of the historical context of China rise today. There are inherently nationalistic ones. Yes, some of them actually talk about kind of traditional Chinese values, moral systems, beliefs, and everything. But most of them are putting more emphasis on how to transform China economically, politically, and militarily so China becomes a strong country. So I actually made the point somewhere saying that it's more about westernizing than really re-Sinicizing. They're not trying to turn today's China into a more Chinese, ancient Chinese type of thing. I think they kind of went beyond that stage. They believe that kind of that something must be changed. China actually were lagging behind because of many of those things.
Thank you. Another asks, I recently heard that humanism is discouraged by the intellectual authorities in China as a foreign viewpoint. Does the Make China Great Again fiction ever entertain humanism as a value, or do literary elites ever assert humanist critiques of the Make China Great Again literature?
Humanism or feminism?
Humanism.
Okay. I'm not quite sure about that question. Thank you very much. I'm not sure about that. Um, it's I don't think most of those works are like that. They demonstrate a very realistic, real political kind of tendency. You can see 129 of those 200 works talk about expansion. They're very unitarian. They're trying to glorify China and kind of make China great again by all means. They are not really kind of, but some of them do, right? As I mentioned, that there was one work about traveling back to the kind of South Song dynasty, which is slightly less than 1,000 years ago, about 1,000 years ago. It's like introducing parliamentary politics and popular election. And they talk about kind of, how to treat everybody kind of, with dignity, right? There's kind of, we're humans. That kind of humanism, there is some discussion with that, but that's definitely not the mainstream.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments, remarks? I think we are ending a little bit early. I'd like to thank everybody for your support of the China Center and the Considering China webinar series. A special thanks to Jaime and Joseph Terry for their generous support of this program. We invite you to help us provide engaging program like this with a gift to the China Center. You may do so through the link on the webinar announcement or on our website. This will be the last webinar for this semester. We will begin again in September. You will receive a survey about the webinar series in the next few days. We would like to hear from you about which webinars have interested you most and any other comments or suggestions you might have. Also, please suggest speakers and topics that would be of interest to you for the next series. I hope everybody will enjoy your summer, and thank you for coming and joining us today. Take care.
Yeah. Since we have a few more minutes, I want to show this last slide.
Okay.
Those web fiction can be wild. Okay, so this is one example there. That's the title. Trump falls in love with me, the White House janitor.
Okay.
And Chinese people write things like that.
That is alt fiction. I think that's
Yeah, it's alt fiction, super fiction. Yeah, this is not alt history fiction though.
It's fiction on every level.
Right.
Thank you, Professor.
Can be very wild.
This is
Yeah.
really wonderful. I really appreciate this discussion today, and enjoy your summer, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.